Hi, I'm Margaret McCarthy, but everyone knows me as Peg. And I'm at the University of Maryland's School of Medicine in downtown Baltimore, Maryland. I started my career looking at hormonal modulation of behavior, and I was interested in reproductive behavior. So I was studying only females, pretty much. But you can't have reproduction without males, right? So you have to have both sexes. And somewhere along the way, I got really interested in the cellular mechanisms in the brain and how it controlled the behavior. And I started to realize that in the adult, it was very confusing because the hormones really varied a lot between the males and the females. And I got more and more sort of granular and wanted more and more simple systems to work with. And there was a sex difference in the brain that was discovered in the 1970s called the sexually dimorphic nucleus of the preoptic area. And I thought, wow, that's really big because it's named for being different in males and females. And so I did a study that looked at the cellular mechanisms by how that brain difference came about, and I was hooked. And ever since then, I've sort of stayed in this research space that's right at the beginning of life, and it integrates the effects of hormones in utero and right around birth and how they permanently sculpt the brain as it develops, and that this can have these enduring consequences for adult sex differences, as well as enduring consequences for sex differences in children, of which there are many in terms of their risks for disease and disorder. I think the first would be that sex differences begin early and endure. A lot of people think of the only time that boys and girls start to differ is after puberty, when they go through different hormonal profiles. But in fact, that really starts in utero. And so the brain is impacted from the get-go pretty much by hormones and XX versus XY chromosome complement. There's also the impact of gender, which we can't divorce from biology in humans, and gender also just begins from the very beginning. It's always there and it's inescapable. And as much as sometimes parents might say, I raised my child in a gender-neutral fashion, well, that's fine for you, but the rest of society is not gender-neutral, and we live in a society, and so they're always going to be impacted by what's going on around them. In terms of the science, I think the important thing is to realize that the brain is still full of surprises. There is so much that we don't understand about the basic mechanisms of how the brain develops. And part of what I've done is use comparing male and female animals to each other as a way to sort of bash them against each other and discover new things. And so I've discovered novel roles for prostaglandins, for endocannabinoids, for neurotransmitters, and then also novel cell type effects, the microglia, the mast cells, the immune cells of the brain, that we never would have seen if we didn't have the comparison of male to female. Because if you just study one sex, you don't know that something's there. It's sort of a nice, by comparing, you also contrast. And so it's been a really nice tool to use. And my talks are titled Surprising Origins of Sex Differences in the Brain, because we keep getting surprised. We can't believe the new things that we're finding all the time. I think Courtney Robinson at Hopkins really pointed out how much we don't pay attention to pediatric brain injury, traumatic brain injury in particular, and how much it might differ in boys and girls. And she revealed things like just the way the blood is flowing through the brain can be different in boys and girls, and that can have profound influences. Because again, we tend to be very neurocentric, and we forget about these other components. The brain exists in a body. One of the things that neuroscientists tend to do is sort of think of the brain as being in a jar and not in a body, right? And they don't think about things like blood flow and oxygen availability and nutrients and things of that sort. And I think that she's starting to take a much more holistic view. I'm also sorry that Don Stein is trapped in Atlanta, and we won't see him today, but we'll hear from him. He's been a real pioneer in the use of steroids, in particular the progesterones, as treatments for traumatic brain injury. And the beauty of his approach is that he's not trying to develop a drug. These are naturally occurring protective molecules, and he's trying to harness their ability to be both protective and restorative. And I think that's a very powerful approach. It doesn't get the attention of the pharmaceutical companies because you can't patent a naturally occurring steroid, but he seems undeterred and is still trying to push this forward in a way that's, he's really gone from the animal models to clinical trials, and while there's been some setbacks in the clinical trials, I think he's making real advances. It's interesting, my trainees tend to try to want to make sure to separate themselves from me, to distinguish themselves. Now they are, most of them still doing sex differences, but they might be doing an adult model of depression via stress. There's some doing juvenile play behavior. I've one looking at a lot of ethanol exposure, fetal alcohol syndrome, drug exposure and things. But the big thing that they're all doing is they always compare males and females. Nobody ever leaves my lab and stops comparing males and females, because that's so essential and has been so underdone in the neurosciences. And we really have a huge gap to fill of foundational information that's only based on one sex. I think it's tremendously exciting to see that there's a focus on thinking about how things that seem like they shouldn't differ between men and women really do, and that they can differ in such profoundly important ways. And it's wonderful that it's coming on the heels of us introducing sex as a biological variable in all preclinical research. You know, Congress mandated back in the 1990s that women, minorities, and children had to be included in clinical research, but they didn't say anything about basic animal research. So while we have expanded the inclusion of women in clinical research, we completely ignored it in the basic sciences to our peril, and that has come back in a bad way because clinical trials have failed that have not had preclinical research on women. But also, even in the clinical realm, while women were included, often the data is not disaggregated by sex. It's not analyzed for effects of sex. They just say, well, there was women in the trial. And nobody's figuring out that, well, maybe the treatment only worked in the men, or maybe it only worked in the women. And there's so much valuable information there. So this is shining a very bright light, I think, across the entire spectrum of NIH research, that we need to attend to sex as an important variable in every realm. And I think that resistance came initially because people wanted to say, well, you know, we don't want to say men and women are different, but different doesn't have a judgment to it, right? It's just different. And we do have an obligation to make sure that our research on health is serving the entire population and not just half of it. And I think that's what this conference is really about, which is very exciting. I think I would like to observe that this is probably the most exciting time in neuroscience research ever. It's still a very young discipline. Our society just had its 47th meeting. If you realize that the American Chemical Society has had over 200 annual meetings, it's still a very young discipline, but the tools that are being developed to image the brain and to sequence the genome and transcriptomes that are unique to the brain are the most cutting edge and exciting ever. And we really need to not lose this momentum and keep our place as the premier research enterprise in the world, and particularly at the NIH, is a crown jewel worldwide of basic and clinical research, and it should be supported unambiguously.